Okay, good morning. We make a start now. This is Visioning the Future, Artistic Doctorates in Ireland. This is our online seminar series, which we've nearly finished. This is the second of our student artistic experiment sessions, and we're really delighted this morning to welcome three really interesting PhD candidates who are going to share their work with us today. The focus this morning is especially on interdisciplinary practices, and we've got two filmmakers and somebody who works with a kind of performance. So I'm really looking forward to getting into the detail of all of those. So the first person that we're going to look at her work this morning is actually my PhD student. This is Carolyn Collier. Carolyn is a PhD in creative practice student in her second year, and she's jointly supervised by me. And also I should say I'm Jules Gilson, and I'm Professor of Creative Practice here at UCC, and I'm head of the School of Film, Music and Theatre, but I'm also a member of the Theatre Department. So Carolyn is jointly supervised by the Department of Theatre here, and also the History of Art Department, and that's Simon Knowles. Carolyn's working title for her PhD is A Practice-Based Perspective on the Performance of the Image and the Aesthetic Experience. Living and working in Ireland, Carolyn Collier is a visual artist and current PhD student, as I've already said. Collier holds an MA in Art and Process from Crawford College of Art and Design, an honours degree in Design Communications from Cork Institute of Technology, and a higher diploma in Art and Design Education from Limerick School of Art and Design. Carolyn works with installation, performance, video, and photography. So I'm going to pass over to Michael, who's going to share Carolyn's video, and then we'll have time to ask questions afterwards.
I might introduce it first, Jules, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay, not at all. Thanks, Jules. Thanks for that intro. I'm really excited, or I'm really pleased to contribute to this research. And as Jules said, I'm nearly halfway through my second year of my studies, and I did my master's here in Cork City in Crawford College of Art and Design, as Jules said, and really arrived at the end of that master's year with way more questions than I did at the start of the year. So that was really the motivation for my PhD studies. So my research takes a phenomenological approach to the creative process of making work, and how this process of making can be translated through performance or in a performative way, and how that can be translated then within the viewing encounter. So all that entails as part of that interrogation includes an analysis of presence as it relates to performance and our experience of creative work, an insight into the materials that I use, so my tactile and active engagement with materials as an artist, and really exploring the physicality of that engagement, an understanding of the embodied experience, so to include all the bodily sensations, as well as thinking and imagining kinesthetically as part of our sensory perception. So today I'm sharing a visual essay, which I thought really suited the seminar series. You know, it's a methodology that I use to process and analyze the ideas and experiments within my work. And I really feel it, you know, it demonstrates my observations, compositions, and reflections as part of my artistic research. Thanks, Michael.
Opmorphing, opmening, morphing, morphing, orpming. Of the image integrates a muscle memory, experience of inside and outside. The motion between embodied and disembodied materials within this haptic perspective. I can feel the bones of an image through extended ligaments as it ropes through me. I feel the intertwined fibers of the present moment and the soft muscle fat substance of the gelatinous oily paint. The aesthetic stain on my memory skin. The aesthetic stain on my memory
The aesthetic stain
skin.
on my memory skin.
Aesthetic
The
stain
stain
on my memory skin. The aesthetic stain on my memory skin.
The material belongs to my gestures as much as my gestures belong to the material.
Thank you, Caroline. I felt this was a very rich piece of work. There's a very strong dialogue between the gestures, the material, the body, the matter. I have a couple of questions. So for me, that was, you used the visual and the sound as strategies, but for me, it was a very visceral experience. So I was wondering, what is it that you're hoping for the viewer to experience when they see the work?
Thanks, Annette. I suppose coming at it from a phenomenological point of view, and being so involved, so that's me within the video. So my initial experience with the work, I am the viewer. So I really enjoy that space. I'm physically involved, and because I'm both the observer and the observed. Being involved in that way allows me to connect to the work and all the aspects then of that process, from initial development to live performance. And it is very visceral when I am engaging with it, and I have to be fully focused within this process, and I have to respond to the material on my skin, and as a form of sense perception, and really explore the materiality within that experience, and look for something that is interesting, and balancing that then with the unexpected. So in terms of the viewer experiencing something, I think performance really allows me to do that. So this is a visual essay, but obviously then within the context of a live performance, really experiencing something like both from the inside and the outside. So really, coming to a performance and having that engagement with it. And it's very exciting for me to kind of, to present the visual essay today, but then to see how that would play out in a live performance, and how the initial engagement that I have with the materials, and how I can push that then for the viewer.
Thank you. I'm quite struck by what you said about I am the viewer. So I think it leads me to think about how you're using the plasticity of different materials and integrated in the different practices. I think Jules, you wanted to add something here.
Yes, I mean, my perspective is very different because I'm Carolyn's supervisor, but I just wanted to add, and I thought it might be really interesting for people in the seminar to have a sense of this, that whilst I've seen aspects of this work before, I haven't seen what you've just shared, Carolyn. And what strikes me especially is your use of voice and your use of that space between, and in our supervisions, which we often do in triplicate, between myself and Simon Knowles from History of Art and Carolyn, we have of late been really talking about that space between the critical writing part of the PhD and the practice part of the PhD. And I wondered if you might speak a little more about that, Carolyn.
Yeah, so I mean, using the voice in the visual essay, the actual sentences within that video came from a creative writing exercise, where it was really trying to explore what it feels like, to have paint in your hands, or what that actually feels like. And I think, working with imagery and working with text, there's only the kind of pictorial representation. I think even the visual essay moves that along, because you can read the sentence, I have paint in my hands, or what that feels like, but I think then the visual brings it to another level, or brings it to another heightened level. And using the voice, then there's all these almost disembodied parts within the video, but then I'm excited to see how they would play out in a live performance, and that's probably the most interesting part for me then as an artist, how they all play out.
And I was wondering if you can tell us more about how you're integrating all these distinct disciplines, because you have a visual arts background, you're in a theatre department, you're talking about creative writing, so you're bringing a lot of different things to the table. So if you could tell us more about how you're managing the interdisciplinary aspect of your practice, and also how that fits in the context of your PhD.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something, again, like as Jules said at the start, I've come through, I've did the HDip in arts and the Masters in arts, so you become very comfortable, portraying your ideas in those different ways. And really, for me, reading the critical, like engaging in critical theory, I think it's been said by a lot of practitioners on this seminar series, it really helps to ground my ideas. And, there is a reciprocal relationship where one influences the other or encourages the other. But it's something that I would have started in my master's, working with different practitioners, and it's really, I mean, I wouldn't, you don't come to at this saying I'm going to be interdisciplinary. It's really what feeds the work. And working, then I worked with dancers and sound artists, and just it really was it was just very enriching, and it comes through the practice then in that way.
Thank you. And before we move on, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the methodologies that you use, because you spoke very briefly about that. So I just wanted to find out a little more.
Yeah, so like I would really be using the visual essay as a methodology as well. So that really helps me to, to process and analyze my ideas. And I think in one of my last supervisions, my supervisor, he said that he understood so much more through the visual essay than my text. So it's really interesting just to see what is the best format for portraying my ideas, and yeah, helping me to kind of understand that.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks.
I've got the pleasure now to introduce our next guest, Monira Ashtani. She is in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University on the 3rd year. Monira is a PhD candidate and the Jean Hume Scholar in the Media Studies Department. She holds a master's degree in animation from the Tehran University of Art in Iran, in addition to a bachelor's degree in visual communication in graphics from the Al Jazeera University, also in Iran. In her interdisciplinary practice-based PhD project, which is under the supervision of Dr. Janine Naji and Dr. Anne O'Brien, Monira is critically analyzing the adaptation of Ferdowsi Shamane into animated form. So I'll pass over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my research is focusing on the adaptation of an epic poem called Shahnameh into animated forms. Shahnameh is written by Abolqasem Ferdowsi and is considered to be the most significant Iranian national epic in existence. This poem is a story of the Iranian ancient kings and heroes starting from the first man king and the foundation of Iran to the fall of the last Persian Empire of Sassanid. So in my project, I analyzed the previous animation adaptations of this text, as well as creating experimental reinterpretation of this narrative into animated forms myself. I particularly concentrate on the notion of abstraction as a specific property of the animation language. So the piece that I'm going to show you is an abstract animation. It's a reinterpretation of a story from Shahnameh called Rostam and Esfandiar. In Shahnameh's word, heroes and kings have a very substantial and favorable relationship. In this story, however, for the first time, these two forces stand against each other in a battlefield. So this story is considered to be one of the most epic and tragic stories of Shahnameh, and kind of an end to his mythical and magical tone. So it's a very interesting story. So in this practice, I aim to avoid the common and famous reading of this narrative, which in a way is very concerned with the realistic and detailed representation of the characters. Instead, I try to look into other layers of the narration, such as its context, emotional state of the characters, dramatic tensions, and its archetypical concepts. So the main reason for this was to de-emphasize the single reading of this text, which is very famous for the benefit of a more radical abstract adaptation, and also opening up to the possibilities of the animated forms, the freedom of its language, and its mutable potencies. So using an experimental abstract approach, I try to examine a few questions that I'm going to say briefly. So I try to examine how and in what ways the text can be unfolded, how such a method can impact the adapter and the audience's interpretation of the text, how this can stimulate the audience's imagination and determine their participation in the process of meaning making, and what sort of concept and meaning can be conveyed. So I'm going to show you my animation, my latest experiment, and thank you for watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Monore. That's really beautiful. I'd like to ask you a few questions. I was struck by, it's a very short film, but I find myself at the end of it kind of wanting to continue to watch. It has a haunting quality, and I'm really interested in how you perform the kind of ancientness and weight of the text, and you described to us in your introduction how this is a very revered and an ancient story. And so you have this kind of, you rapidly take us through the kind of literary narrative of it in the opening section, and then we shift to this visual choreography. Could you tell us a little bit about your whether this kind of abstract response to this kind of large narrative that has a particular impact in Iranian culture, whether this is something that you have been doing before this PhD project, or if it's a new thing that you're doing as part of the work for your doctoral studies?
I started doing this for my PhD. Like before my PhD, I was familiar with Shahnameh, but Shahnameh, the position of Shahnameh in Iran is very sensitive. Like culturally, is a very sensitive text, and even a slight change about the text, like for example, a little bit of appropriation in characters, or for example, emphasizing the role of women, because the text is very old and masculine, like it's belonged to 1,000 years ago. So, and it's actually, its history is much, much older, but the text itself belonged to 1,000 years ago. So even a very slight change about the text has a lot of debate and maybe criticization. So I was familiar with this, and there are a lot of animation about the text, but they are all stick to the famous reading of the text, and they are all mostly representational, like in a style of animation. But for my PhD, I started doing this because first I researched the existed animation. So I did a case studies, and it was interesting how everybody tried to stick the famous reading of the text, and how they were all representational, figurative animation. I found one kind of minimal animation which has never been publicly shown. It was an artistic work which went to festivals, but it was still figurative, but it was more minimal. So it was interesting for me, and it kind of guided me towards my experiments to see what is going to happen if somebody approach do an abstract approach. Why is so awful to, because you know, Shahnameh, the interesting things about Shahnameh is as you read it more and more and more, you see the context, the rich context that is behind the text, and can be much more interesting than a very simple reading of the story of two characters fighting and saying the same stuff. So that's how this happened.
No, that's really interesting. And I think what I found interesting in the little piece of the animation that you showed us today is that it's abstract, but actually it's both. It's also it has a very strong narrative to it, and it's interesting that the things I notice are the kind of subtlety of the line in the center. I was just curious. I just Googled, you know, the Iranian flag, because I'm not familiar with it, but I wonder if that's an element of what you're doing there, because of the red and green, and you have distinctively this purple and yellow, very different, but you also have these two blocks of color and then this central circle, and that's the first part that we have. So what I found enchanting about the work, and knowing very little about Iran and Iranian culture, is that you find ways to animate, not just literally but metaphorically, kind of subtleties and textures of relational dynamics, as well as, you know, the layering of the sound, and the way that the texture of the surfaces have this kind of resonance of ancientness, and at the same time it's very kind of lively. Yes. So that's really a response rather than a question. Inesh.
Thank you. Just following up from what Jules was saying, I was wondering how you made those decisions in terms of the process of making the work, those visual decisions about the blocks, the circles, where does it come from, how it relates to the context of the wider PhD. So I'm kind of interested to find out a little bit more about your process.
So one thing that, before starting my practice, I really did a comprehensive research on adaptation. And I talked to some practitioners, which, because my research is practice-based, I actually like to work from the viewpoints of practitioners. So I talked to many, and there was an agreement that there should be, the spirit of the text should remain. It doesn't matter what technique or how far you go from the text, but if you are recreating a cultural thing or a text that has a weight to it, and you want to reflect that, the spirit of the text should remain. So some of the choices that I make is based on the Iranian culture, but the other choices, like for example, colors, the circle, the forms, are more based on the context of the story, which is a universal thing. Like Shahnameh has a very rich universal tone, that you can find in a lot of epic poems, like Homer, like Gilgamesh, a lot of other epic from the other part of the world. For example, the conflict, the hero journey, the dualistic paradox between two forces. So that was one thing that I chose that helped me to choose the forms and the colors. But the texture, the text, and the specific flowers that you kind of become figurative a little bit, they were inspired by Iranian culture and a little bit of Islamic, actually, which might be interesting because like the history of the text is pre-Islamic, but the text, the Shahnameh itself, was written during the Islamic era of Iran. So I kind of try to bring the Asianness in the text and in the texture, but also I use a sort of flowers that belong to the Islamic miniature and painting. So that was my choices. And mostly I try to reflect this paradox that exists between these two forces with two very distinct color. And the choices of color was based on my research about the common colors known for a hero, for a prince. Like, for example, I choose the gold for the sovereign power, the prince and the king, and I choose the blue for kind of bluish and purplish for the hero, which has a mysterious character. So they were based on my research about archetypical places of those characters.
Sorry, thank you very much.
Thank
you. Really appreciate that contribution. We'll move on now to JP McMahon, our final presenter this morning. So I'm delighted to have JP with us today. JP is a fourth year student in NUI Galway in the Theatre and Drama department. The provisional title of his PhD is Staging Irish Food, an Auto-Ethnographic Approach. Now, JP McMahon, you may have heard of him before. He's a well-known chef, restaurateur, writer, and symposium director of Food on the Edge. As well as running 3 award-winning restaurants, he's completing a PhD in drama at NUI Galway, and his research focuses on staging food, its affect, and how it creates differing conflicts of context, depending where it is created and consumed. So all of that's very relevant because we've made the decision not to broadcast JP's video right now, but it is available for viewing on our website. And Michael, if you could put the link to that in the chat. And the reason that we've done that is because some viewers might find the content distressing, but actually that's also part of the content of the research itself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just talk about what the video is, and then we're going to kind of have a discussion, JP and I, and we've had a bit of a chat this morning. And I just so happens that actually food and culture is something that I'm really interested in myself and have a research interest in and have taught for many years. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with JP. So the video presentation that JP submitted to us today is a video that's straight on, and it remains in a still focus. It's JP, it's you performing, isn't it? Yes, you need to unmute, please.
It is indeed, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So you can mute again there just while I speak. Thank you. So it's JP performing, but you wouldn't know that necessarily because he has a pig's masks on. And during the process of the video, it's JP kills and cooks a lobster. And the performative way that he does this is really interesting because there's very beautiful music that accompanies it, but the mode of performance is quite staccato and demonstrative. So it's very much, here's the lobster, and here's a great big knife, and here's the killing of the lobster, and here's the cooking, and then the eating of the lobster. And then importantly, over the top of that is a discussion, a kind of annotated bibliography about quite an old exploration of the ethics of eating animals and whether or not they can experience pain. And that goes through Descartes and Jeremy Bentham, and then to more recent philosophers. So I personally, even though I love eating lobster, although I don't do it very often, I found the video distressing to watch. But what that performs, both to myself and I think perhaps more generally, is that hypocrisy that sometimes or maybe often is apparent for those of us who do eat meat, which is that we're often quite divorced from the processes by which they get to our table. So a really interesting, rich discussion, hopefully there. So I'll JP, if you want to unmute, do you want to say a bit more about the video, and we can open up the discussion from there?
Yeah, I suppose my research, I suppose, looks at, food on stage and Irish food on stage and performing food. I mean, my background is diverse. I attempted a PhD in another life in art history in UCC, so the guys will know me there. And my subject was Regina OConnor, who was quite a visceral performance artist. And when I went back and did an MA in English, I suppose I ended up back in theatre because I love it. And coming from the angle of performance art, I was very interested in the effect and how food affects people. And particularly in the context, because in the restaurant, some days we might, I don't know, kill 20 lobsters and we have no time to think about it. But it's not only about the lobster. I think the more I put the lobster on stage, the more the performance came about the lobster. Whereas I was just as interested in someone eating like duck, or someone eating an oyster, or any sort of vegetables, or even having animals dead or alive on stage and what that might mean. And so for me, food kind of cuts across theatre in the sense that it almost kind of brings the outside in, and we struggle to, whether it's representation or presentation. I mean, when a lobster dies in a kitchen, it's I suppose it's an act of eating, and there are various ideas associated with that, whether it's leisure or celebration or wealth. But when a lobster dies on stage or in a theatre, there are a lot more different questions, whether it's the ethics of killing something on stage, or, as came up in the previous iteration, it's whether the actors want to touch the lobster, whether they're comfortable with it, whether the stage manager wants the lobster on stage, or whether the director has an understanding of, well, can lobsters jump or not, and can they attack someone? And so these are things that I suppose I had never even thought about before. But this is probably the 5th iteration that I've done as part of my research. And I suppose I'm fascinated in the sense of kind of critically thinking about why we're affected so much. And I look at effect theory in one aspect of my research, but then also how the context determines our approach. And if I was to perform a cooking demonstration on stage, I don't think too many people would be as bothered as if I was to perform a piece on stage and kill a lobster as part of a performance. So that, like, there are various different strands there, but certainly this kind of tension or conflict that comes about between the theatre and you mentioned ethics, Jules, but I think the environmental approach or the ecology of it is very important as well, because theatre struggles to I suppose bring in ecology. Theatre is always like, I suppose, a box, or it's always cut off from its environment. And how do we bring issues, whether it's food or climate change, or how do we address them that goes beyond merely representing them and then discussing them later?
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, no, really interesting. I mean, a lot there. One of the things that strikes me about the traditional way that theatre deals with food is that it's not very good at it. It kind of pretends, in kind of, I don't know, a dusty version of theatre or an old-fashioned version of theatre, we might have, tinned stew to represent a lovely, homemade cooked bit of Irish stew. We might have tea representing red, or Ribena representing wine. So there's this sense of not having real food. In some of the courses that I've taught, we look at a play, for example, it's from the 70s called The Art of Dining by an American dramatist. And what's interesting there is that all of the food is cooked. It's all cordon bleu cooking, and it's beautiful cooking, and it happens on stage actually. So it has much more to do with the direct cooking demonstration that you kind of described there. And so that all of those affective things of actually smelling the food are satirized within that play, but they also literally happen, and it makes a huge difference. And I think what you talk about there about the difference between food, the food in the professional world and theatre is really stark. But there's also a kind of much broader version of kind of theatre, and increasingly I'm struck, for example, in the Midsummer Festival, which normally happens here in Cork, how little theatre actually happens in theatres, and so that so many performative and performance and theatrical events and dance events happen in alternative spaces, and that it seems to be very much part of the zeitgeist to actually explore things through interdisciplinary forms and interdisciplinary contexts. So another artist that you might know from here, or an artist group that you might know from here in Cork, is the Domestic Godless, Mick O'Shea, for example, and his colleagues, who also satirise a kind of the way that food is used. So that there's a lot there. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to any of that.
Yeah, no, certainly. And when we put on the play I wrote, Irish Food, a play, we staged it as part of the Dublin Fringe Festival in a restaurant, and that adds another layer again. And so it's very interesting, and I suppose I'm very interested in both modes of expression, and also when I suppose when you fold that theatrical experience back into the restaurant, particularly what we do in Aneer. I mean, what we do is very, very theatrical and very, very performative and very staged every night, and there isn't there's a lot of correlation between what one does in a fine dining restaurant and what one does in the theatre and that. And so these are, I suppose, elements that I'm looking to explore.
Ines, did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay.
No, nothing in particular. I think I was thinking how that might relate to your PhD, JP, and to the wider context of your research. But I think you touched on that already.
Yeah, like I mean, I'm a food writer as well, and like sometimes I feel I am living in two different worlds. And I suppose the idea of the research is how to bring these two discourses together, because even in the everyday, in the university, in the departments, they are separated. And so it's kind of to a certain degree, it's trying to push against the grain of why they're separated, and I suppose how that separation came to be, and the dialogue or the absence of dialogue between the two things. And I suppose I even found that particularly with art history as well, and the many art historical movements or artists that use food as well, and that kind of the absence of dialogue between those two things. So it's an ongoing interest of mine.
Thank you. we actually have a question from the audience for you, JP, so I'll direct it right now, which is, what was the reaction to the lobster killing at Fota? What was the intention, and did Kevin Thornton do some similar with the rabbit?
Yeah, so actually that's Regina. Hi, Regina. I didn't kill the lobster for Food on the Edge, but Kevin Thornton in the first year skinned a rabbit on stage, and also opened up a sea urchin, and I think did it along to Pink Floyd music, and it was part of a very serious food symposium where people would speak about the future of food, and Kevin's and one or two others were extremely artistic and extremely performative, and they kind of punctured the whole mood in the sense that a lot of the audience didn't understand it, because when you bring artistic elements into the culinary world, even though the culinary world is very artistic, there isn't a language or a critical discourse to deal with it, and some people either see it as an aesthetic performance that stops there, or they see it as whether it's satirizing or commenting on the environmental aspects of this, and I suppose I try and keep that interest, and it's very much that kind of interdisciplinary approach between the food culture, art, and performance.
Yes, I just wanted to come back there. Thanks for that, JP. One of the things that strikes me is that really resonates with me, what you've just said there. Regina and I actually did a series of presentations at the Ballymaloe Festival of Literature and Food, which happened for over about 5 years, a few years ago. And then I did a separate event actually once, which was looking at food and performance and critical thinking. And it was really interesting to do it in that absolute food context. So I spoke particularly about a British performance artist who you may know called Bobby Baker, and her work, it's really interesting in terms of its feminism and its exploration of fine art as well as food practices. And there was people were kind of a little bemused, but it was very much a really different context. So it is really interesting to me how sometimes challenging it is to frame things in different contexts. And I wanted that to link that in a way back to your presentation for today, which we didn't speak about the fact that you wear a pig's mask when you're doing this. And it's interesting because that certainly adds to the level of how disturbing I found it. And I think that's partly to do with the iconography of the pig's mask, which we often associate with kind of horror movies or murder or murderers, but also there's obviously the link to pigs themselves and the fact that we eat them. And so I just wanted to ask about that as a choice, because the combination, the visual iconography of the pig's mask and the very big knife, it's very much removed from what I imagine is the great busyness of the kitchen when you're preparing 20 lobsters of an afternoon or whatever.
Yeah, the knife is the same. I don't know, maybe it just looks bigger on film, but the knife is the same. But the pig's mask, I suppose, came about by chance in the first iteration. And I suppose for me, ironically, it was more about being anonymous as well. I didn't want to draw attention to myself as a chef. And I did want to there is an alienating device there in the sense that I don't want people to see me killing a lobster, because, I mean, that's probably less effective. The idea, as you said, of the pigs, and pigs would eat lobsters and probably not even think about it. Pigs would eat us and not even think about it. And the last one is, I suppose, that intertextual reference. I'm a big fan of The Butcher Boy and Pat McCabe, and so that reference there is that, like, pigs in relation to Ireland and Irish food are very central for a couple of thousand years. So there is that iconography attached to it, and of course the kind of macabre element and that fear that it creates is part of it. Because again, I wanted the real question is how we feel about it and how it affects us. And as you said there about Ballymaloe, the audience is everything, and depending on what audience you have in front of you, you get an entirely different effect.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question, I think.
Yes, so to all of you with us today, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A and we will begin addressing them. I'll start with a question for JP, since we are closing this conversation on the lobster. Does Joseph Boyer's social sculpture directly influence your thinking and acting in this space?
Absolutely, and I'm very interested in the avant-garde, particularly in relation to performance art, from Dada all the way up to American performance art. And I do think that these works, and Carly Schneemann and Judy Chicago, there's a lot of artists in that period that use food and utilize food. So I'm always thinking about them, and even in the context of the restaurant, and sometimes, of course, it is how far you can push things and how far you can get people to do things. So that always informs my practice to a certain degree. Probably not as much as Domestic Godless, but I mean, of course, those guys very much inspire me as well.
Thank you. And this is a question for the panel in general, in terms of the evaluation of PhDs in artistic research. So the question is, how are PhD theses like this being evaluated, and can they ever fail? So I guess what I would like to ask you is to tell us a little bit about how you're going to be, how your work is going to be evaluated by the panel, any challenges you might have in regarding to the Viva, if or whether you'll be showing your work for the Viva. Caroline.
Yeah, I think even, attending these seminar series has really kind of opened up my eyes an awful lot to that end process, and it's something that you're always thinking about. And there was really interesting points brought up maybe this week or last week. I think Helen Phelan talked about the process of the Viva, and the process of using critical text, and how that might not suit the actual artistic practice. So I think it's really for me, I'm very excited. I mean, I get so much from critical writing, and I really see it as making, and it's structural and or sculptural almost, and you are coming at it from that way. But I am excited about presenting work in terms of live performance, and using the visual essay that I would have shown today as well, and critical text, and hopefully then that they all portray my ideas and my contribution to knowledge then in that way.
Monira or JP, would you like to add?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think for me, I practice as research very much is suits me, considering like I attempted another PhD for 6 or 7 years that was entirely thesis orientated, and I think that having a balance between a critical element and a performative element very much suits me. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to, I suppose, integrate the two of them into each other. And I think particularly from a creative and artistic background, it allows people to, I suppose, to undertake a PhD that is practice based.
So I think like practice-based PhD is it has its own challenges, because it's not easily comparable to other sort of PhDs. So maybe the evaluation needs to be also more specific to practice-based research. So I'm not close to my Viva. I still have 3 terms left, so I don't have that much knowledge about how it's going to be evaluated. I'm not in that part to discuss that yet with my supervisor, but as other participants told, like they talked they were very interesting, like it's something that I should start thinking about it. But as I think Caroline said, I hope that my critical research, my contextual review, case studies, and practice, they all come together and contribute to the knowledge.
Thank you. Jules, is there anything you'd like to add to that conversation on evaluation?
Yeah, I think, no, I just wanted to thank you really in terms of the kind of range of the research that we've got here this morning is really compelling. And I think that for us as supervisors and as researchers in the kind of area of the pedagogy of the PhD and as examiners as well, it really challenges us to kind of think about how we develop processes for evaluation and for examination, and there are so many different models, and I think that my sense is that within Ireland we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of how those practices happen, both from between different PhD students, but also the different institutions. I mean, it's so interesting, Monterey, that you're in a media studies department, and that Carolyn is in history of art and a theatre department, and JP, you're in a theatre and drama department, but actually all of your work is quite interdisciplinary. And I think, it's interesting because both Carolyn and JP work with performance, and I know that you don't, Monterey. So there's perhaps there's an ease of just in terms of being embodied, that it's hopefully less likely to be challenging if you're doing a performance or a screening closer to it. But that just a really kind of simple fact of if you are doing installation work or performance work and then doing some form of critical defense is the kind of normal way to say it. But it's, again, an unfortunate term because it sets it up already as almost one of your animations, Monterey, that there's this one over here and this one, and you have to defend it. Now, I understand why that's the case, and to some degree that's also what we need to do, but I think having broader context for how we think about examining the PhD would benefit all of us. So I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts of that. I know you're at different places, but do you have any wish lists about how you would most like your practice and your critical aspects of your PhD to be examined?
Hey, sorry, I think there's a lot of I suppose there's a lot of scope internationally for different practices research programs. So I mean, I suppose I'm less worried about the integration of them. I hope the difficulty is I suppose who is doing the examination. And I think as Patrick, my supervisor, said to me, I think the external examiner is very, very important, and making sure that they are informed about, or they're coming from a practices research background to balance out. I think you definitely need both elements. So I think that is that's critical. And the different, I suppose, mini vivas I've had over the last 3 years, I found very interesting, depending on if I'm talking to someone, and I hate to say it, with a straight PhD or someone with a practices research PhD. I think both of them inform, and I think it's about sculpting like a dialogue between the two practices.
Thank you. If Carolyn and Monterey didn't have anything to add to that, we might just take the last question, Ines. We have one more question and then we'll be about to close. Thank you, JP.
Thank you, Jules. So last question for Monterey. How does your animation describe love, conflict, and peace in the Shahnameh?
Well, I hope that the most important aspect of my animation be the movement, and then the form, the colors, and association between the text that I put, which I believe the text itself is also abstract, and the images. So I think through the color and the forms, there are those sort of colors and forms has a very ancient meaning. So they can, and through the movement and the morph between the scene and the images, I hope that shows, that's kind of convey the story. But it also needs an audience point of view. Of course, I cannot just comment myself. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to kind of bring the seminar to a close. I'd like to heartily thank our panelists today, Carolyn Collier, Monterey Stani and JP McMahon. I've really enjoyed the crossovers and the contrasts between your projects, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have an insight into the work that you're doing. So thank you all. This is our penultimate seminar. It's been a long haul. This is number 14 of our seminar series. So our last one is next week, next Thursday, and we'd love it if you could join us for that. And in that, we're going to reflect on the seminar series and really look forward as well to ask how this whole project and this seminar series can support us in developing supports and policy, and how we work together for artistic doctorates in Ireland. So thank you all very much, and thank you to Inish and to Michael Ryan behind the scenes. So I'll hopefully see you next week. Bye-bye.